The rain-soaked stranger. The rain fell heavily over the city of New York, blurring the lights of skyscrapers into soft streaks that looked like falling stars. Inside the glass-walled restaurant perched on the 58th floor of the Orion Tower, the sound of thunder was muted, replaced by the low hum of violins and quiet conversations of people who measured their worth by stock portfolios and luxury watches. At a table by the window sat Ethan Cole, the man whose name carried weight in boardrooms across continents. At 42, he was a self-made millionaire, owner of Cole Enterprises, a real estate investment firm that turned abandoned city blocks into architectural masterpieces. His suits were tailored, his reputation spotless, and his focus razor-sharp. People said Ethan could spot opportunity in chaos. What they did not know was that beneath the calm surface of his success, something essential had gone missing years ago. The more wealth he accumulated, the emptier he felt. Tonight he was not thinking about profits or acquisitions, but staring at his untouched dinner, plate of grilled salmon and truffle risotto, growing cold while rain drummed against the glass. The restaurant's manager approached quietly, asking if he wanted the meal reheated, but Ethan only shook his head. He had eaten here almost every night for years because it was convenient, predictable, and quiet, exactly like the life he had built around himself. Perfectly controlled, yet completely lifeless. As he leaned back, trying to drown his thoughts in the rhythm of the rain, a sudden movement at the entrance caught his attention. A young waitress was arguing with the hostess, gesturing nervously toward the door where a small figure stood dripping wet. The maitre d' shook her head firmly, insisting that the place was private, that people like that couldn't come in. Ethan followed their gaze and saw a girl standing just beyond the threshold. She couldn't have been more than 11 or 12. Her clothes were soaked through, her dark hair plastered against her cheeks, and in her hands she clutched a torn paper bag. Her eyes, large and unblinking, scanned the room until they locked onto Ethan's table. For reasons he couldn't explain, his chest tightened. There was something arresting about the child, not in her appearance, but in the calm stubbornness she carried, as if she had walked through the storm with a purpose no one else could understand. The hostess tried to close the door, but the girl took a step forward and said something Ethan couldn't hear through the glass. The manager moved to escort her out, his face a mask of polite annoyance. Before he could, Ethan raised his hand slightly. The staff froze. Everyone in the restaurant knew who paid most of their salaries. "Let her in," Ethan said quietly. The hostess hesitated. "Sir, she's not—" "Let her in," he repeated, his tone final. The girl entered, leaving small wet footprints on the marble floor. She kept her chin high despite the curious glances that followed her. When she reached his table, she didn't speak at once. Instead, she looked at the half-eaten food in front of him. Ethan expected her to ask for money, maybe leftovers, the way street children sometimes did outside expensive places. But there was something different in her gaze. Not begging, not greed, but an almost painful resolve. Finally, she said softly, "If you give me the leftovers, I'll tell you a secret." For a moment, Ethan thought he had misheard. A few diners laughed quietly. Someone whispered something about street theatrics. Ethan's eyebrows lifted. "A secret?" he asked, his voice calm, curious. She nodded. "Yes, but only if you promise not to get angry." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." The girl hesitated, then climbed onto the seat, her small hands trembling slightly from the cold. Ethan pushed the plate toward her. "Go ahead." She didn't reach for the fresh food the waiter tried to bring. Instead, she took the exact plate Ethan had been eating from. She picked up his fork and began to eat the remaining risotto with surprising delicacy, as though she had once known manners but had lived too long without warmth. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. When she finished, she drank the last sip of his water, then looked up and said simply, "You don't remember me, do you?" Ethan blinked. "Should I?" The girl's eyes softened with a kind of sadness that made her seem far older than her years. "Maybe not. You were busy being important." He leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Who are you?" "My name is Lila," she said quietly. "Lila Monroe." The name meant nothing to him at first, but when she reached into her paper bag and pulled out a faded photograph, his world tilted. The photo was old, edges torn, the colors washed out. But Ethan recognized the place immediately, a small diner from his hometown, long before wealth and skyscrapers. And beside a younger version of himself in that picture stood Grace Monroe, the girl he had once loved before his career consumed everything else. Grace had been sunshine and laughter. She believed in kindness more than ambition. He had left her without goodbye when he chased his first big contract in Chicago, promising to return but never did. She had written once or twice, but he never answered. Seeing her face again hit him like a blow. Ethan's voice came out rough. "Where did you get this?" Lila's fingers tightened around the picture. "She gave it to me. Before she got sick." Something inside Ethan cracked open. "Grace, is she—" "She was my mother," Lila said. The words hit him harder than any business failure ever could. For a long moment, the noise of the restaurant faded until only the sound of rain remained. He stared at the girl in disbelief. The curve of her jaw, the dimple that appeared when she frowned, they were Grace's. Memories he had buried under layers of success came rushing back. Their long walks by the river, her dream of opening a small bakery, the night he promised he'd make something of himself and take her away from that small town. He had kept half of that promise. He had made something of himself, but at the cost of breaking everything else. Ethan's throat tightened. "Your mother—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "She's gone," Lila said quietly. 2 months ago. She told me to find you." He felt the air leave his lungs. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, to deny, but the girl continued before he could. "She said you should know the truth before it's too late. That's the secret I came to tell you." Her voice wavered for the first time. "She didn't die because she was sick, Mr. Cole. She died because she never stopped believing you'd come back." The words struck like lightning. Ethan sat back stunned. The child's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "When she got sick, she used to sit by the window every evening waiting for you. She said one day you'd drive back down that street in your fancy car and take her to see the ocean she always talked about. She saved every letter she wrote you, even the ones you never answered." Lila reached into her bag again and took out a small bundle tied with a red ribbon, yellowed envelopes addressed in graceful handwriting. Ethan recognized them instantly. Grace's letters, the ones his assistant had placed in a drawer years ago when he was too busy to read them. Ethan felt shame rise like fire under his skin. He remembered those days too well. The rush of early success, the meetings, the arrogance of thinking love could wait while ambition couldn't. He had assumed Grace moved on. He had told himself that distance and time would erase the past. Now the proof of his selfishness sat in front of him, eyes filled with a hurt that should have been his to bear. Lila untied the ribbon and slid one envelope across the table. This was the last one she wrote before she died. "She made me promise to give it to you." Ethan hesitated before picking it up. His hand shook slightly as he opened it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, Grace's favorite scent. Her handwriting was still neat despite the faint tremor of illness that showed in each line. "Ethan," it began, "if you're reading this, I guess I didn't get the chance to see you again. I don't write to blame you. I just want you to know that the best years of my life were the ones before you left, because they taught me how much love can grow even when it's never returned. I forgive you. Always did. Take care of our daughter. She's braver than I ever was." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. He looked up at Lila, realization dawning fully now. "Our daughter," he whispered. She nodded. The ground beneath his identity shifted completely. He, Ethan Cole, the disciplined, untouchable businessman, had a daughter he had never known, a child who had grown up in poverty while he dined in penthouses. The contrast tore him apart. Lila continued softly. "Mom said you weren't a bad man, just lost. She said money makes people forget what matters until it's gone." Her small hands clenched on the table. "She wanted me to tell you that it's not too late to remember." Ethan's voice broke. "Where have you been living?" "In shelters, sometimes with my mother's friends. After she passed, I didn't know where to go. Then I found her old things, a photo of you, this letter, and a list of restaurants you liked. I thought maybe I'd find you here." He felt something inside him fracture and rearrange all at once, the kind of moment when a life of pride collapses into the truth of being human. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. "Come with me. You'll have everything you need." But Lila shook her head firmly. "That's not why I came. I didn't come for money. I came because my mom said you needed to learn how to give, not buy." She looked around the restaurant where waiters froze mid-step and patrons tried to pretend they weren't eavesdropping. You eat alone in the sky while people down there look for crumbs. Mom said that's the loneliest kind of rich, when you can afford anything except peace. Her words hit deeper than any insult. Ethan had heard thousands of speeches about morality from investors, politicians, and self-help gurus. But none had pierced him like the simple truth of a child who had nothing left to lose. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't have an answer. The empire he had built seemed hollow. He thought of all the projects he had launched that displaced families, of the deals where he cut corners and justified it as just business. He thought of Grace, waiting by a window that faced a street he had long forgotten, believing in him until her last breath. He closed his eyes briefly, then stood. "Come," he said gently. "Let's go somewhere warm." The staff hurried to open doors as he led Lila outside. The rain had softened into a mist, the streets glistening under the city lights. Ethan removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. They walked silently to his car, a black Bentley that suddenly felt like a symbol of everything meaningless. As they drove through the rain-washed streets, Ethan spoke quietly. "Lila, I can't change what I did, but I want to make things right. I want to know everything about your mother, what she loved, what she dreamed of." Lila stared out the window. She loved the smell of cinnamon and the way sunlight hit old books. She used to say that kindness is the only wealth that grows when you give it away. Ethan swallowed hard. "Then we'll start there." When they reached his penthouse, Lila hesitated at the entrance, staring at the expanse of marble floors and panoramic views. It looked more like a museum than a home. Ethan noticed it too for the first time, how empty it felt despite the art in glass and steel. He guided her to the living room, turned on the fireplace, and asked the housekeeper for warm food. When she returned with a tray, Lila refused again. "I don't want new food," she said softly. "I just want what you already have." The phrase struck him with strange power. She wasn't asking for possessions. She wanted something deeper, a place in the space he already occupied, a share of the life he had walled off from feeling. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch wrapped in a blanket far too big for her, Ethan sat alone by the fire reading every letter Grace had written. Each one peeled back another layer of the man he had become, the boy who once believed success meant proving himself, not realizing that love had been the real proof all along. As dawn approached, he looked at Lila sleeping peacefully and made a silent vow. He would not let her grow up thinking kindness was weakness. He would rebuild his empire on something her mother would have been proud of. Grace had believed he could change. Now it was his turn to prove her right. Outside, the rain stopped and the first rays of morning light reflected off the city skyline. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something real awaken inside him. Not ambition, but purpose. The secret the girl had brought him had shattered his heart. Yet in the brokenness, he found the one thing all his money could never buy: a reason to begin again. The secret she left behind, morning broke over the Manhattan skyline like a soft sigh, turning the glass towers into columns of gold. Ethan Cole sat alone in his living room, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside him. He had not slept. All night he had read Grace's letters one by one, each word a whisper from a woman he had once loved and abandoned in his pursuit of power. The fireplace still glowed faintly, casting warm light on Lila's small figure curled beneath a blanket on the sofa. Every few minutes, Ethan's eyes drifted toward her, as if to make sure she was real and not a cruel dream designed to punish him for the past. She was the living proof of his greatest failure and perhaps his only chance at redemption. Outside, the city was already awake, impatient and restless. Cars honked far below, and the endless rhythm of commerce began again. But Ethan felt as though he stood apart from it all, watching a life he no longer recognized. He had built his fortune on concrete and ambition, yet now, sitting in silence with a child sleeping in his home, he realized that success without meaning was just another form of poverty. He thought of Grace waiting by her window, believing in him, and the weight of that faith pressed down until he could hardly breathe. When Lila stirred and sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, Ethan straightened. She blinked at the unfamiliar surroundings before her gaze landed on him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she asked softly, "You didn't sleep, did you?" He shook his head with a faint smile. "No, I was reading your mother's letters. Lila hugged her knees to her chest, her expression unreadable. She wrote a lot. She said writing made her feel less lonely. Ethan looked down at his hands. She shouldn't have been lonely, he said quietly. That was my fault, Lila tilted her head. She never blamed you. That simple sentence cut deeper than any accusation could. Grace had forgiven him long before he ever asked for forgiveness, and that made the guilt heavier. Ethan stood, walked to the large window, and stared at the sprawling city below. Your mother believed in kindness more than ambition, he murmured. She tried to teach me that once, but I was too blind to listen. He turned to face Lila. I don't want to be that man anymore. Lila watched him carefully. Then be someone different. Her words were small, but they carried the quiet authority of truth. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar deals, yet this child's simple honesty left him speechless. He nodded slowly. Will you help me? She smiled faintly. Maybe. But you'll have to start by doing something you're not used to, listening. After breakfast, Ethan took her to a small garden terrace that overlooked the park. The city stretched endlessly around them, but up here the noise softened into a hum. Lila sat cross-legged on a bench, her hair shining in the sunlight. She told him stories about her mother, how Grace used to work long shifts at a small bakery, how she would bring home leftover pastries for the neighborhood kids who couldn't afford sweets, how she volunteered at a community shelter every weekend even when she was exhausted. Ethan listened quietly, his heart aching with every detail. Grace had built her life around giving, while he had built his around taking. The contrast was unbearable. Lila pulled something from her pocket, a small silver locket on a worn chain. Mom wanted you to have this, she said, placing it in his palm. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny photograph of him and Grace from years ago, taken at that same small-town diner where their story began. On the opposite side was a folded piece of paper. He opened it and read the single line written in Grace's familiar handwriting. If you ever find this, remember that love isn't lost. It's only waiting for courage. The words seemed to pulse with life. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Grace had known him better than anyone, even after years apart. She must have known that wealth would never fill the emptiness left behind by guilt. He closed the locket and slipped it into his pocket like a sacred vow. Later that day, he received a call from his office. His assistant, Amanda, informed him that the investors were waiting for his signature on a new project, a massive development deal that would replace several low-income neighborhoods with luxury condos. Ethan hesitated. Only yesterday he would have signed without a second thought. But now he imagined the faces of families being pushed out, the children who would have nowhere to play except the shadows of skyscrapers. Postpone the meeting, he said. Amanda's surprise was audible. Sir, they've flown in from Singapore for this. I said postpone it, he repeated firmly, ending the call. Lila looked at him curiously. Did you just say no to something important? He smiled faintly. Maybe for the first time in years. That afternoon he decided to take her somewhere. Your mother and I used to have a place, he said as they drove out of the city. The car glided along wet roads lined with trees glowing amber and gold. It's where we used to talk about dreams before I traded mine for numbers. Lila looked out the window as countryside replaced concrete. After 2 hours they arrived at a small town by a river, quiet and untouched by time. Ethan parked outside a boarded-up building with faded paint, the old diner from the photograph. The door creaked when he pushed it open. Dust hung in the air like forgotten memories. Lila wandered to the counter, tracing her fingers over the cracked tiles. This is where she met you? She asked softly. Ethan nodded. I was broke, working construction across the street. She used to bring me coffee for free because she said my eyes looked tired. He smiled faintly at the memory. She believed in people before they believed in themselves. They spent hours cleaning the place together, sweeping the floor, opening windows to let in the scent of autumn. Lila laughed for the first time since he met her when a gust of wind blew flour from an old sack into Ethan's hair. The sound of her laughter filled the empty diner like music, and for a moment, it felt as if Grace was there with them, smiling from somewhere beyond sight. As evening approached, they found an old notebook under the counter, Grace's handwriting again. It was filled with recipes and small notes. On the last page she had written, "Dreams don't die. They wait for the right hands to finish them." Ethan's hands trembled as he closed the book, She wanted to open a bakery here, he said quietly. We used to talk about it all the time. Lila looked up at him. And maybe you still can. The idea struck him like sunlight through clouds. He had spent years investing in skyscrapers and global markets, yet the thought of rebuilding this small diner into a bakery in Grace's memory felt more meaningful than anything he had ever done. Yes, he whispered. Maybe that's how I start over. They drove back to the city under a twilight sky painted in pink and gold. Lila fell asleep against the window and Ethan watched her reflection, his heart heavy with something new. Not guilt, not pride, but purpose. He realized he didn't just want to build a bakery. He wanted to build a future that reflected Grace's spirit, one rooted in kindness, compassion, and second chances. Over the following days, Ethan's world began to shift. He returned to his company, not as the ruthless CEO everyone feared, but as a man with questions. He called his board into an emergency meeting and stunned them all by announcing a new direction. Coal Enterprises will no longer invest in projects that displace communities, he declared. From now on, we rebuild neighborhoods, not replace them. We'll use part of our profits to fund shelters and small businesses. There was silence in the boardroom. His CFO stared at him in disbelief. Sir, that's philanthropy, not business. Ethan looked at him steadily. Then maybe it's time business learned to be human again. News of his statement spread quickly through the media. Some praised him as visionary. Others dismissed him as sentimental. Ethan didn't care. For the first time, he felt aligned with something that mattered. Lila watched the news on television and smiled proudly. Mom would have liked that, she said. She used to say the best way to fix a mistake is to turn it into a promise. But change came with resistance. Within a week, his investors began to pull out of deals. Journalists speculated about his mental state. Old partners called to warn him that empathy didn't pay dividends. Ethan listened to all of it quietly. He had spent his life serving shareholders. Now he served something far greater, the memory of a woman who had believed in his heart even when he didn't. One night, as he tucked Lila into the guest room, she looked up at him and asked, Do you ever think about what would have happened if you never left my mom? Ethan's chest tightened. Every day, he said. But if I hadn't made those mistakes, maybe you wouldn't be here to remind me who I should have been. She smiled sleepily. Mom said everything happens so love can find its way even through pain. After she fell asleep, Ethan stood by the window again, looking out at the glittering skyline. For the first time, it didn't feel like a symbol of success, but of responsibility. Grace's voice seemed to echo in his mind. Love isn't lost. It's only waiting for courage. He realized that courage wasn't about facing competition or markets. It was about facing yourself. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began renovating the old diner. He named it Grace's Table. It wasn't just a bakery. It was a place where anyone could eat, regardless of whether they could pay. Word spread quickly, and soon people from all walks of life came. Office workers, construction laborers, students, and single mothers. Ethan worked there every weekend, wearing an apron instead of a suit, serving pastries with a smile that no camera had ever captured before. Lila helped at the counter, laughing with customers, her presence turning the place into something magical. One afternoon, a journalist visited to write a feature about the millionaire who gave up luxury for compassion. When she asked Ethan why he was doing this, he replied simply, Because a little girl once asked for my leftovers and gave me back my soul. That evening, after closing time, he found Lila sitting by the window of the diner, the same way Grace once waited for him. The sunset painted her face in soft light. Do you think she'd be proud of us? He asked. Lila smiled. She already is. She's in every smile you give, every person you feed, every heart you touch. You're finally listening to her. Ethan nodded slowly, emotion thick in his voice. Then I'll never stop listening again. Outside, the neon sign flickered to life, glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Grace's Table, a place where kindness is served daily. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole felt truly rich. The price of redemption. The months that followed the opening of Grace's Table brought both warmth and turmoil into Ethan Cole's life. Every morning he would rise before dawn, trade his polished suits for a simple shirt and apron, and drive to the little bakery that had once been a dusty ruin. The smell of cinnamon, fresh bread, and roasted coffee now filled the air each day, wrapping the place in the same comforting scent that Grace had loved so much. Lila was always by his side, her laughter weaving through the clatter of cups and chatter of early customers. To the people who came there, Ethan was not the millionaire who once ruled skyscrapers and stocks. He was simply Ethan, the man who served kindness with his pastries. Yet while the small town embraced his transformation, the empire he had built in the city began to tremble. It started with whispers from shareholders. Newspapers that once praised him now questioned his sanity. The fall of Ethan Cole, one headline read, while another speculated that Grace's table was a publicity stunt to distract from financial collapse. Former partners sent veiled messages demanding that he return to serious business, while investors withdrew millions, warning that compassion had no place in corporate growth. His phone buzzed constantly with messages he chose not to answer. He had spent most of his adult life chasing validation from these very people, and now, for the first time, he realized he didn't need their approval anymore. The only voice that mattered was the one that whispered through Grace's memory, "Do what's right, even if no one claps." Still, the storm grew. Late one evening, after closing the bakery, Ethan returned to his penthouse to find two men waiting in his lobby. They wore tailored suits, their smiles too sharp to be friendly. One introduced himself as Marcus Hale, an attorney representing the board of Cole Enterprises. "Mr. Cole," he began smoothly, "I'm afraid we need to discuss your recent decisions. The shareholders believe you're jeopardizing the company's financial stability. Your refusal to pursue the luxury projects has cost millions." Ethan leaned against the marble counter, calm but firm. "If doing the right thing costs millions, then maybe we were earning the wrong way." Marcus's smile tightened. "Idealism doesn't pay dividends, sir. Business runs on confidence. You're not only risking profits, you're risking your legacy." Ethan met his gaze evenly. "My legacy used to be greed dressed as success. I'm rewriting it." The men exchanged a glance. "If you continue this path, the board may move to remove you as CEO," Marcus warned. Ethan paused for a long moment, the weight of those words hanging between them. Years ago, the threat of losing his company would have terrified him. Now it only confirmed that he was finally on the right path. "Then let them," he said quietly. "The company was never my soul. It was my shadow." When they left, Ethan walked to the window overlooking the glowing city. He felt a strange calm. The skyline that once symbolized triumph now looked fragile, like a monument to hollow ambition. Behind him, the penthouse was silent, yet in that silence he felt Grace's presence, a warmth that steadied him. The next morning, Ethan returned to the bakery earlier than usual. Lila was already there, arranging flowers in a small vase by the window. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "You look tired," she said gently. "Long night?" Ethan nodded. "The board wants me gone." Lila thought for a moment, then said something that would echo in his heart forever. "Then maybe you're finally free." He blinked, surprised by the simplicity of her wisdom. "Free?" She nodded. "You used to belong to money. Now you belong to people. That's better." As the days passed, Ethan noticed something remarkable. Even as his business empire faltered, Grace's table grew. It wasn't just a bakery anymore, and it was a movement. People came not only for food but for hope. Strangers shared stories of kindness across tables. Homeless men found warmth without judgment, and single mothers were given free meals without paperwork or pity. Local newspapers began to write about the miracle diner where love was baked fresh daily. Soon, volunteers from across the city arrived wanting to help. College students offered to paint murals. Retired teachers read stories to children. Local farmers donated produce. Ethan realized that Grace's dream had become something larger than either of them had imagined. It was changing hearts one cup of coffee at a time. But behind every miracle, there was always a price. One cold November evening, while Ethan was cleaning up after closing, a familiar voice echoed from the doorway. "You've changed, Ethan, but not in a way that benefits anyone important." He turned sharply and saw Richard Lang, his former partner, a man who had once called himself Ethan's friend but whose greed was legendary. Richard walked in slowly, his expensive shoes clicking on the tiled floor. "You could have had the entire skyline under your name," he said. "Instead, you're wasting your time feeding people who will never afford a single share of your company." Ethan wiped his hands on a cloth, unbothered. Maybe that's exactly the point. Richard's smile twisted. You think compassion makes you noble? It makes you weak. The world doesn't reward kindness, Ethan. It devours it. Ethan stepped closer, his tone steady but firm. Maybe. But I've spent my life devouring others in the name of success. I think it's time I feed the world back. Richard's expression darkened. You've made enemies in high places. Investors are furious and they've found ways to strike back. You might want to check tomorrow's headlines. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out into the night, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and warning. Ethan spent that night awake again, staring at the locket around his neck. He remembered Grace's final letter, her forgiveness, her unwavering belief that love could heal what ambition broke. Whatever came next, he knew he had to protect Grace's table and, more importantly, protect Lila, the living embodiment of everything Grace stood for. The following morning, the newspapers carried a brutal headline: Coal Enterprises CEO under investigation for financial misconduct. False accusations flooded the media, suggesting that Ethan had diverted company funds into his charity venture. Anonymous insiders claimed he was using the bakery for tax evasion. The story spread like wildfire. By noon, reporters swarmed outside both his home and the bakery. Lila watched from the window, her eyes wide with fear. Are they going to take you away? She whispered. Ethan knelt beside her, forcing a smile. No one can take away what's true, Lila. We just have to stand firm. But standing firm in a world built on lies was never easy. The board called an emergency meeting that evening, and Ethan was officially removed as CEO. Decades of work were stripped away with a single vote. As he left the glass tower that once bore his name, flashes from reporters' cameras followed him like lightning. Questions were shouted, microphones thrust toward his face, but he said nothing. When he reached the street, he exhaled deeply. The air felt cleaner than it ever had inside those walls. That night, when he returned to the bakery, Lila was waiting with 2 cups of hot chocolate. Does it hurt? She asked softly. He sat beside her and nodded.
Yes, it does.
But sometimes pain is proof that your heart is working again. She handed him one of the cups. Mom used to say the same thing. She said broken hearts make room for light to come in. Ethan looked at her with quiet wonder. Grace's voice truly lived in this child, not just in words, but in spirit. Days turned into weeks, and though the scandal raged on, something extraordinary happened. Customers continued to come. Donations arrived from people who had never met him, but had read about Grace's table and believed in its mission. One letter came from an elderly woman who wrote, "Your bakery saved my grandson from giving up on life. Please don't stop." Another came from a school teacher who said, "You reminded my students that kindness can be powerful." Each message became a small flame against the darkness trying to swallow him. Yet, amid the quiet resilience, Ethan began to notice something troubling. Lila had grown quieter, often gazing out of the window for long stretches. When he asked if she was all right, she would smile faintly and say she was fine, but her eyes betrayed a shadow of pain. One evening, after closing, he found her in the storeroom clutching her mother's locket, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. She hesitated before whispering, "I miss her so much. Even when I laugh, I feel guilty, like I'm forgetting her." Ethan knelt and wrapped his arms around her. "You're not forgetting her," he said softly. "You're living the life she wanted for you, one filled with light. That's how you honor her." As she cried against his shoulder, Ethan realized that the love he felt for this child had become the compass of his life. He would protect her no matter what it cost. He no longer saw her as a reminder of his past mistakes, but as proof that redemption was possible. Winter arrived early that year, coating the streets in white. Grace's table glowed like a lantern in the cold, serving soups and bread to anyone who entered. One evening, as snow fell thick outside, an envelope slid under the door. Ethan picked it up curiously. There was no return address, only a wax seal he recognized immediately. The same seal his former board used for confidential correspondence. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a sentence that froze his blood. "You think you're helping the world, but you've made enemies who don't forgive. Walk away now or you'll lose more than your name." He stared at the note for a long time, the firelight reflecting off his troubled eyes. Lila was in the back room humming softly as she cleaned. For the first time since he met her, Ethan felt a tremor of fear, not for himself, but for her. Whoever had sent the note knew where to reach him, and that meant they could reach her too. That night, as he stood by the window watching snow blanket the streets, Ethan made another silent vow. He had already lost Grace once because of his blindness. He would not lose her daughter to the cruelty of the world he used to belong to. Whatever it took, he would face the shadows of his past and protect what truly mattered. The next chapter of his redemption was no longer about rebuilding a business or cleansing a reputation. It was about defending love itself. Shadows of the past, the snow kept falling over New York, covering the world in soft silence, but inside Ethan Cole's heart a storm was raging. The anonymous threat letter had awakened an old fear he thought he had buried long ago, the fear of losing someone he loved. He had already lost Grace because of his blindness, and now the idea of losing Lila was unbearable. For the next few days he pretended everything was normal at Grace's table, smiling for the customers, laughing at the little jokes Lila made, but behind those smiles lived a deep vigilance. He began to notice unfamiliar faces lingering too long outside the bakery, cars that seemed to idle across the street without reason, and a man in a black coat who appeared near closing time several nights in a row. He told himself he was imagining it, that paranoia was the price of his guilt, but instinct whispered otherwise. Something was coming. One night after they closed the bakery, Ethan was cleaning the counter while Lila packed away leftover loaves for the shelter run that evening. The lights inside were warm, reflecting softly on the glass windows, but outside the snow had turned into a slanting rain that blurred everything into gray. When the bell over the door suddenly rang, both of them turned. A man stepped inside wearing a hooded coat, his face hidden in the shadow. "We're closed," Ethan said politely, but the man didn't move. Instead, he pulled the hood back and smiled. Ethan's stomach tightened. It was Richard Lang, his former business partner. The same man who had once been his closest ally and was now the voice of his downfall. "You really should lock your doors," Richard said lightly, shaking off the rain. "New York can be dangerous, especially for men who make enemies." Lila froze near the counter, her small hands tightening around the paper bag she was holding. Ethan's voice hardened. "What do you want, Richard?" Richard's eyes swept around the cozy little bakery before resting on Ethan again. "I came to offer you an opportunity, a way out of this mess before it gets uglier. You see, you've made quite a few powerful people uncomfortable with your sudden moral awakening. They want to make sure Grace's table doesn't become a symbol that inspires others to follow." Ethan crossed his arms. "So they sent you?" Richard smiled thinly. "Let's just say I'm trying to help you. Sign over your shares of Cole Enterprises, step away quietly, and this place, this pretty little bakery, stays untouched." The air thickened between them. Ethan's jaw tightened as he stared at the man he once called a friend. "You're threatening a child's home for money?" Richard's expression didn't waver. "It's not personal, Ethan, it's business. You know how the world works. The powerful can't afford symbols of defiance. If they destroy you publicly, no one else will dare to challenge them. I'm giving you the chance to walk away with dignity." Ethan's voice dropped to a low growl. "You talk about dignity while you sell your soul to keep your wallet full." Richard sighed and stepped closer. "You're still naive. You think kindness can survive in a world built on greed. It can't. It will swallow you and the girl too. Do yourself a favor. Disappear before the storm hits." Ethan didn't answer. He simply walked to the door and opened it wide, letting the cold rain pour in. "Leave, Richard, and tell whoever sent you that I won't sell what's built on Grace's name. Not now, not ever." Richard looked at him for a long moment, then gave a slow, mocking smile. "Then I'll see you when the storm arrives," he said softly, and stepped out into the rain. After he left, Lila came to Ethan's side, her eyes wide and frightened. "Who was that man?" she whispered. Ethan hesitated, then said gently, "Someone who lost his way." She looked down. "Is he going to hurt us?" He knelt beside her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "No one is going to hurt you, Lila, I promise. You have my word." She nodded slowly, trusting him completely, though the shadow of fear lingered in her gaze. That night, long after Lila had fallen asleep in her room upstairs, Ethan sat alone by the bakery window, watching the rain carve glistening rivers down the glass. He thought about Grace and how she had faced hardship without bitterness, about how she had protected her daughter with nothing but courage and love. If she could endure years of struggle without giving up, then he had no right to back down now. He decided to fight, not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. If the powerful wanted to silence him, then he would make his voice impossible to ignore. The next morning, Ethan called a press conference in front of Grace's table. Reporters gathered, drawn by curiosity and controversy. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched forward, and the cold wind carried the scent of coffee and courage. When Ethan stepped outside wearing a simple coat and holding Grace's locket in his hand, the crowd hushed. He spoke calmly but firmly. "Many of you have heard lies about me. They say I used this bakery for profit or that I lost my mind. The truth is simpler. I lost my heart long ago, and this place helped me find it again. Grace's table isn't a business. It's a promise to feed, to heal, to remember that humanity is worth more than any fortune." He paused, meeting the eyes of the cameras directly. "If telling the truth costs me my wealth, so be it. But I will not let fear destroy what kindness has built. Grace Monroe taught me that love is the only investment that never fails, and I intend to protect her legacy with everything I have left." His speech spread across social media within hours. Millions watched, and for every critic who called him foolish, 10 more called him brave. Donations flooded in from around the country, and volunteers arrived from distant cities, all saying they wanted to help keep Grace's table alive. It was as though the light Grace had kindled years ago had finally found its way into the world, carried by the people she had inspired without ever meeting them. But light always casts deeper shadows. 2 nights later, after closing, a fire broke out in the back of the bakery. The alarm blared, smoke filled the air, and Ethan rushed to get Lila and the 2 employees out safely. Flames spread quickly through the kitchen, devouring the wooden beams and licking up the walls like orange serpents. Outside, sirens wailed as firefighters battled the blaze. Ethan stood in the snow, watching his dream. Their dream burned before his eyes. Lila clung to his arm, crying softly. "Is it gone?" she asked through tears. Ethan stared at the collapsing roof and whispered, "Only the walls, sweetheart, not the heart." The next morning, investigators confirmed what Ethan already suspected. The fire had been deliberate. An accelerant was found near the back door. It was arson. The news devastated the community. People gathered outside the charred remains, leaving flowers and handwritten notes. One note simply read, "You fed us when we were hungry. Now we stand with you." Ethan was moved to tears, but beneath the sorrow burned a new resolve. Whoever had done this had underestimated the power of what Grace had built. They could destroy the building, but they couldn't destroy the belief that had grown inside people's hearts. Lila refused to let despair take over. Standing among the ashes, she turned to Ethan and said, "Mom used to say fire doesn't only destroy. Sometimes it clears the way for something stronger." Her words struck him like a spark in the cold. He looked at her, this child who had endured so much yet still carried hope like a torch, and realized that she was right. Grace had passed her strength to their daughter, and now that strength was lighting his path. Within a week, donations began pouring in again. Carpenters, painters, and neighbors offered free labor. Even strangers from other cities arrived to help rebuild. The story of Grace's table spread beyond New York, turning into a symbol of resilience. News anchors called it the bakery that refused to die. Every hammer that struck a nail, every brush that touched paint, carried the rhythm of something sacred. Ethan worked side by side with everyone, his hands blistered but his heart full. He no longer cared about boardrooms or reputation. This was real wealth built on unity and love. One evening, as they were finishing work for the day, a police car pulled up. An officer stepped out holding a file. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we've made an arrest related to the fire." Ethan's breath caught. "Who?" The officer opened the folder and revealed a photograph. It was Richard Lang. He hired 2 men to set the fire, thinking it would bankrupt you. One of them came forward when he wasn't paid. Ethan's fists clenched involuntarily. The betrayal, though not surprising, still cut deep. Richard, the man he had once trusted, the man who had stood beside him at business summits and toasted to success, had tried to destroy him for choosing compassion. But instead of anger, something else rose within Ethan. Pity. He realized Richard was not his enemy. Greed was. The same greed that had once lived in him. He thanked the officer and signed the statement quietly. Later, when he told Lila, she asked softly, Are you going to hate him? Ethan shook his head slowly. No, Lila. Hating him would only make me like him. I'll forgive him not because he deserves it, but because your mother would have. Lila nodded, her eyes shining. Then she'd be proud of you. Spring arrived by the time Grace's table reopened. The new bakery stood brighter than before, with wide windows and soft lights. The community filled it with laughter, music, and stories. On the opening day, Ethan gave a short speech, his voice steady and warm. This place burned down, but so did my old life. Fire took our walls, but it gave us something better. Faith. Grace believed in giving even when she had nothing. Today, her dream lives on through every one of you. The crowd erupted in applause. Lila stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. When the first customer walked in, a homeless veteran who had once found refuge there, Ethan smiled and handed him a loaf of bread fresh from the oven. The man's eyes filled with gratitude as he whispered, "You kept your promise." That night, when the lights dimmed and the last guests left, Ethan and Lila sat by the window of the rebuilt bakery. Outside, the city shimmered with life, but inside there was peace. Lila leaned her head against his arm. "Do you think Mom can see this?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up at the stars beyond the glass. "I think she's the reason it shines so bright." He reached into his pocket, pulled out Grace's locket, and placed it on the table between them. Inside, beneath the old photograph, he had added a new one. A picture of the three of them standing in front of the rebuilt Grace's table, smiling beneath the spring sunlight. For the first time in years, Ethan felt whole. He had lost his wealth, his company, his reputation, but in that loss, he had found the one thing that mattered, a family built on love, forgiveness, and purpose. As he watched Lila drift to sleep beside him, he whispered softly to the empty air, "Thank you, Grace, you saved me twice, once with your love, and once with your memory." And somewhere in that quiet moment, as the city lights reflected off the glass, he could almost swear he heard her laughter, warm, gentle, and proud. The promise that never died, the following summer unfolded like a gentle miracle. The rebuilt Grace's table had become more than just a bakery. It had become a living testament to what love could build from ashes. Every morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows, filling the place with golden warmth as the smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted down the street. People from every background came to eat there, workers, students, single parents, elderly couples, and they all left with smiles that carried something lighter than just full stomachs. Ethan often stood quietly behind the counter, watching the laughter and conversations ripple through the room like music. It was the sound of life healed by kindness. What began as one woman's dream had turned into a sanctuary of humanity. But even as joy returned, Ethan knew life would always test the promises worth keeping. The scandal that had nearly ruined his name was slowly fading, but his old company, Cole Enterprises, was still in chaos. Without his leadership, it had turned into a battlefield of greed. Former partners were suing one another, projects had stalled, and thousands of employees faced uncertainty. News outlets ran headlines like, "The Empire Without Its Heart." Ethan didn't feel pride in seeing it crumble. Instead, he felt a deep responsibility. He had walked away from that world to save his soul. But part of him still felt accountable for the people working under his name. He couldn't stand by and watch them suffer, not when he finally understood what true leadership meant. One evening, while cleaning tables with Lila, he made a quiet decision that would change everything again. "I have to go back," he said softly. Lila looked up, her eyes questioning. "Back where?" Ethan placed the last plate down, his expression thoughtful. "To the company. Not to reclaim it, but to fix what's broken, for the people who still depend on it." Lila frowned, sensing the heaviness behind his words. "But you said that place was full of shadows." He smiled gently. "Sometimes to end a storm you have to go back into it. Not to live there, but to bring light." The next day, Ethan went to the city for the first time in months. He walked through the glass doors of the towering building that had once been his kingdom. Everything felt colder. The lobby that used to echo with ambition now seemed filled with emptiness. Employees glanced at him with surprise, whispering as he passed. Some looked guilty, others relieved. He rode the elevator to the top floor where the board of directors was meeting, the same people who had voted him out months ago. When he entered the room, silence fell. The men and women seated around the polished table looked uneasy, like ghosts caught in the light. "Ethan," said Marcus Hale, the lawyer who had once delivered his downfall, his tone wary. "We didn't expect to see you here again." Ethan nodded. "I didn't expect to come back. But I didn't come for revenge or titles. I came because thousands of people are about to lose their jobs because of decisions made without conscience. This company was built on dreams. My father's, my own, and those of every worker who believed we stood for progress. I can't stand by while it turns into a monument of greed." One of the board members scoffed softly. "You gave up your right to lead, Ethan. You traded this empire for a bakery." Ethan met his gaze calmly. "That bakery feeds hundreds every week and has restored more souls than this building ever will. But I didn't come to argue about worth. I came with a proposal." He placed a thick folder on the table. Inside was a restructuring plan, a blueprint to convert coal enterprises into a foundation for sustainable housing, green projects, and community investments. It would cut profit margins but ensure stability, ethics, and long-term impact. "If you care about saving the company," Ethan said steadily, "follow this plan. If not, keep your profits and watch it collapse from its own corruption." The room was tense. Some murmured in agreement, others in fear of losing control. Finally, Marcus leaned back and studied him. "You've changed, Ethan," he said quietly. "Once you would have fought tooth and nail for power. Now you walk in and hand it away." Ethan smiled faintly, because power was the disease, not the cure. The real cure is purpose. By the time he left the building, he didn't know whether they would accept his plan. But something inside him felt settled. He had done what he could, not as a businessman, but as a man trying to set right what he had broken. As he stepped into the sunlight outside, a sense of peace replaced the tension that had lived in him for years. He looked at the sky and thought of Grace again, of how she used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Weeks passed. The media eventually reported that Coal Enterprises had agreed to restructure under his model. New leadership had been appointed, one that prioritized community rebuilding and environmental projects. The company's reputation began to recover, this time on the foundation of honesty rather than illusion. For the first time, Ethan's name was not linked to scandal or wealth, but to compassion. Journalists wrote articles calling him the man who turned power into purpose. Ethan didn't seek the attention, but he was grateful that the good Grace had inspired was still growing far beyond her lifetime. At Grace's table, life resumed with quiet joy. The bakery became a place where stories of hope met every sunrise. Lila had blossomed from a shy, wounded child into a confident young girl who dreamed of becoming a writer. She often sat by the window with a notebook, capturing stories of the people who came in, veterans who found work again, single mothers who opened small shops after getting help from the bakery's charity fund, and children who came every Saturday just for the warm cookies and laughter. She titled her notebook, "The People My Mother Would Have Loved." Ethan often watched her write, his chest swelling with pride and tenderness. One afternoon, while closing the bakery, Ethan found an envelope placed neatly on the counter. There was no name, only the words, "For Ethan Cole," from someone who believed in Grace. He opened it slowly and found a letter written in elegant handwriting. It was from a woman named Julia, who had been Grace's friend years ago. The letter read, "Dear Ethan, Grace once told me that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted you to know that forgiveness isn't an ending, it's a beginning. She believed you would find your way back, not because you owed it to her, but because love never stops calling those who've lost it. I kept something she left behind. It's for Lila, her mother's journal. Inside, you'll find the dreams she never had the chance to finish. Maybe now, with both of you, they can come true." Ethan's hands trembled as he unfolded a second item inside the envelope. A small, leather-bound journal, worn with time. The first page held Grace's handwriting, gentle and familiar. "One day, if Ethan ever reads this, tell him that love is not measured by what we take, but by what we give away. And if he's standing in a world built on kindness, then my heart is home." Tears blurred his vision as he closed the journal and pressed it to his chest. Lila came up behind him and touched his arm. "What is it?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled through the tears. "It's your mother's last gift, and maybe her greatest one." Together, they sat by the window reading the journal late into the night, pages filled with Grace's thoughts, recipes, letters to her daughter, and small dreams she had written for the future. Some were simple, like teaching Lila to bake cinnamon rolls. Others were profound, like opening homes for orphans and shelters for the homeless. The next morning, Ethan announced a new plan. "We're going to expand Grace's table," he told Lila and the volunteers. "Not to make it bigger, but to make it reach farther. We'll build small community kitchens in every city we can, each one run by people who've known hardship and found hope again. They'll all carry her name." The idea spread like wildfire. Donations poured in, and soon small branches of Grace's table began opening in nearby towns. Each one served free meals, offered job training, and shared Grace's message. Kindness is the currency of the soul. Years passed, and the dream kept growing. By the 10th anniversary of the first bakery, there were over 50 Grace's Table centers across the country. Each one bore a plaque that read, "Founded in memory of Grace Monroe, built by the hands of those she inspired." Ethan, now older, often visited them quietly, watching the same spark he once saw in Grace now living in countless others. One evening, he sat outside the original bakery, now glowing under strings of soft lights. Lila, now a young woman, brought him tea and sat beside him. "Do you ever miss the old life?" she asked. Ethan smiled, his eyes reflecting the stars. "Sometimes I miss the view from the top floors," he admitted, "but only because I didn't know the better view was here, at ground level, where hearts meet." She laughed softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Mom would have loved this." He nodded. "She does. Every time we share a meal, every time someone smiles, she's here." As the night deepened, Ethan looked out over the city, a city he had once tried to conquer but had finally learned to serve. The lights shimmered like 1,000 little promises, each one glowing with hope. He thought about the journey that had started with a girl asking for leftovers and ended with a world fed by love. He realized now that Grace had never truly left. She lived in the kindness that continued to spread from one heart to another, carried by the very people who once had nothing. Before closing his eyes that night, Ethan whispered the words that had become his creed. "Love is the only wealth worth keeping." And as sleep claimed him, a breeze moved through the open window, gentle and warm, like a whisper from the woman who had taught him everything that truly mattered. In that moment, surrounded by the hum of life, laughter, and the soft glow of Grace's table, the story of Ethan Cole, the man who traded ambition for compassion, came full circle. The millionaire who once measured success in numbers had learned the greatest truth of all, that the richest life is one spent giving. And somewhere, beyond time and rain and regret, Grace smiled, proud that her love had built not just a bakery, but a legacy that would feed hearts forever. The end.